Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Trevor Chu, and I would like to welcome you to the 2022 BLIA North America Cloud Lecture Series. Today, I'm very honored to introduce two special guests, Mr. Erik Ralske and Dr. Noa Kageyama, who will be giving a lecture entitled The Karma of Music. Mr. Erik Ralske is internationally recognized as one of the leading horn players in the world. He currently holds the position of Principal Horn of the Metropolitan Opera Orchestra in New York City. In addition to his current appointment, he has held positions in the New York Philharmonic, Houston, Vancouver, and Florida Symphony Orchestras. Apart from his very active performing career, he is the current professor of French horn at the Juilliard School, Manhattan School of Music, and Mannes College of Music. Just like Mr. Ralske, Dr. Kageyama is also a world-class musician who plays the violin and has had a successful performing career appearing as a soloist with orchestras such as the Columbus Symphony. Dr. Kageyama now spends his time as a performance psychologist, where he specializes in teaching performing artists how to consistently demonstrate their full potential under high-pressure situations. He is currently a professor at the Juilliard School and works as a performance psychology coach for the New World Symphony. He also is the author of The Bulletproof Musician, which is a website with an online course on how to deal with performance anxiety. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to our special guests today, Mr. Erik Ralske and Dr. Noa Kageyama.
Hi, welcome to the Karma of Music. My name is Erik Ralske. I'm Principal French Horn of the Metropolitan Opera, and I am faculty member at the Juilliard School. Prior to my time with the Metropolitan Opera, I was a member of the New York Philharmonic for 17 years. I'm also a practicing Buddhist. And today I would like to discuss in this program how Buddhism has had a profound impact on my life as a musician, but also how my life as a performer, as a musician, has complemented my life as a Buddhist and helped me to practice Buddhism in my daily life. I kind of think it's a two-way street, that Buddhist practice can certainly help a musician to become a better performer. And yet, as a performer in our pursuit of perfection and musical greatness, I think that the skills we learn as musicians can aid in our understanding and our practice of Buddhism. Master Venerable Xingyen has said in his writing called Buddhism and Music, quote, Music gives us the capacity to express deep emotions. Whether through holy hymns or chants of praise, music is capable of uplifting the mind to an almost sublime state. As such, it has a significant role in the promotion of religion. I would say that in my experience, I would add that there's something inherently spiritual in music even without text. The great composer and conductor Leonard Bernstein once said, quote, music can name the unnameable and communicate the unknowable. So the spiritual power that inherently seems to exist in music, it only increases when it accompanies spiritual texts like the hymns and the chants that Master Xingyen has referred to in the previous quote. I think one of the unanswerable questions about music is, where does it come from? I don't think anybody can say, but archaeologists will tell you that it can be traced back to the earliest signs of human existence. And it has actually quite an interesting role in evolution as well. The first earliest physical examples of music in primitive man's life goes back to about 42,000 years BC. In Germany, they discovered flutes that were made out of bones in caves by primitive man. Surely before this physical evidence of music was probably vocal music. I mean, singing would be something that wouldn't require any technical skills like manufacturing instruments. Scientists believe that this musical sharing in the earliest times of civilization, that it kind of was a form of social bonding. When you think about lower primates, chimpanzees, you've seen videos of grooming as a social function because chimpanzees are social creatures, much like human beings. And so in early human beings, they believed that music was the thing that sort of was the glue amongst the first settlements of communities in human beings. Probably this early form of music began as rhythmic clapping, singing, and dancing. Some of the earliest instruments might have been drums, the bone flutes that I mentioned earlier. And because music brought people together, scientists do believe it actually had a very important role in evolution and that natural selection, where if music was such a core element to social groupings in early man, that the more musical um, people of that time were maybe more desirable mates. And that was in itself a form of like natural selection. And maybe why music is such an important impulse as human beings. We can't go through our days without music, and it seems to be a common thread in all civilizations around the world throughout history. It's also easy to see that maybe this socialization of man through, at first, music, because music is a way of communicating without words, but then led and helped lead at least to the formation of language, communication. And of course, that led to a sharing of ideas. Sharing of ideas then leads to a growth in technology and whatnot, and general development. So the need for human beings to communicate is part of that urge to make music in the first place. And as I said, music is something that could be expressed without words. And it's obviously something that's essential to us. We're musical by nature, going back to the earliest times. Now, getting back to the karma of music. Karma, of course, can be explained by the concept of cause and conditions, that nothing exists without cause and conditions that lead to something existing in this moment. So the concept of dependent origination explains that nothing stands alone by itself, nothing is separate, everything affects everything else. And music is no different in that regard. To understand the most basic cause and conditions about music is to have some kind of understanding about its history and its development. And we talked about from the most primitive times. Let's work from the present tense going backwards, though. There is no genre of music that we enjoy today that would exist without the cause and conditions that help create this music, which of course can be traced back all the way back to earliest civilizations. But working backwards here, any of the popular or contemporary music that we listen to today, of course, that wouldn't exist without one of the great classical composers, Beethoven. But just a couple of decades before Beethoven was Mozart. You wouldn't have Beethoven without Mozart, because Beethoven's music was so influenced by Mozart. And there would be no Mozart if there wasn't Bach, who came another half century before Mozart. And on and on and on we could trace back through time There were many developments, of course, over thousands of years that led to Bach and having the language that he used and built and grew further without what came before him. So a more specific example of cause and condition and a sort of a evolution of music, if you will, is jazz music specifically. Jazz music actually has its root in slavery. Slaves were brought to colonial America in the year 1619. They were forced into Christian culture and were taught hymns and some of the church music. And yet they retained some of the musical traditions that they took with them from Africa, from the culture there. And they started to incorporate these into the hymns. And they sang hymns as they worked all day, and started to incorporate some of these things that can be traced back to African musical traditions. One of these is improvisation, because nothing was necessarily written down in a formal way in African music, that people would improvise it. It'd be passed down by ear from generation to generation. People would embellish and even on the spot improvise. Another musical form was call and response. You would have a solo singer singing a line, and you'd have a group of people answer them, either absolutely mimicking or playing off of what was just sung. And that's actually a technique that you hear even in rock and roll music. Where you have like a solo singer and you've got a backup group. Tribal rhythms came out of Africa and were incorporated into the music in America in the colonial period. And all of these traditions found their way into some of the hymns. And of course, they had their own popular music. And the popular music, American popular music in the 1800s, was also embellished and incorporated by the slaves some of the traditions of music that came out of Africa. The hymns and spirituals that they sang in church with the African influence, we've referred to those actually as spirituals. And that style of spirituals with the African elements of music in them became basically the blues. Some of the other popular music in America that the African elements that were incorporated into it became forms of early jazz. You've heard of Scott Joplin, and he was famous for writing a style of music called a rag. And the rags of Scott Joplin are, of course, made very popular even 100 years after he lived. But the Scott Joplin himself was an African American, and this was an early form of jazz. And that syncopated rhythm was something that, again, came out of African sensibility in terms of very rhythmic and lively numbers. That also led to other early forms of jazz. You have Dixieland music. And these early styles of jazz then evolved throughout the 20th century. Later, maybe in the middle of the century, you have swing music, bebop music. The blues, as I mentioned, came out of the spirituals, but eventually became rhythm and blues. And of course, you have modern jazz today, which again is just a more modern language of the same kind of style that was developed as African influences from the slaves infused into American and Western music. In this case, the karma part of it is really interesting to note, that the cause and conditions that created this whole style of music we call jazz. And of course, jazz gave birth to other forms of music like rock and roll and rap music and R&B and all those other styles that we enjoy today. But the origin of jazz and the karma of it actually came from something as horrific as slavery. And that was just an interesting thing to contemplate, that, as compared to the analogy I made before about there would be no Beethoven without Mozart, that all seems like a very sort of positive force in the world. Here you have something terrible like slavery that led to something, though, that's quite wonderful, of all these various forms of music, that, thank goodness, what came at something positive that came out of that was the music that we enjoy today can be traced directly back to slavery. So that's a little bit of the cause and condition, the karma of music. In our next segment, I'd like to share with you a very interesting interview I have with a colleague from faculty member at Juilliard, Dr. Noa Kageyama. And we met at Juilliard earlier today for a dialogue and discussion. As a performance psychologist, he has a lot of insight to techniques that help people that I think are very consistent with Buddhism, to help them overcome performance anxiety and become better performers, as well as a more philosophical look at music through a Buddhist perspective. So we hope you enjoy. Thank you. So at this point, I'd like to introduce a special guest, Dr. Noa Kageyama, who has a PhD in counseling psychology. And he's also here on faculty at Juilliard. Welcome, Noa. And could you please tell our audience a little bit about yourself and basically how you came into the field of counseling psychology?
Sure. So once upon a time, I was a young Suzuki student studying the violin. I started at age 2 and continued on through college, ended up here for grad school at Juilliard, still playing the violin and fully intending to go on to a career in music. But then I happened to be looking for classes to take one semester, and I saw that this fellow named Don Green was teaching a class called Performance Enhancement. It was about performance psychology and sports psychology, which I'd never heard of up until that point in the 90s. And
it's sort of a new field, relatively, right?
Yeah.
You have that in the world of sports, but not so much in the world of music.
Absolutely,
right?
Yeah. It wasn't something that musicians were looking into or knew about, or was presented to them. So I took the class and wasn't expecting much, but was really surprised at how practical and how useful everything we learned was, and it started changing how I practiced on a day-to-day basis. It changed how I approached performing, how I felt on stage. Ended up doing one of those big every 4-year kind of international competitions my second year here, and wasn't really prepared, honestly. Like, I spent more time hanging out with my girlfriend that summer, who is now my wife, so that worked out. But that was
time well invested,
right. Yes, I think one could argue that. But all this to say, I wasn't really prepared. There's multiple rounds of rep. I didn't have the third movement of the concerto that the competition was named after memorized or really even learned yet. There were other pieces here and there throughout the rounds that I just hadn't looked at for months, if not a year or two. And so I was really not in a good place. But I ended up playing better than I should have that first round because of all the work I had done kind of preparing mentally and so forth, and passed on to the second round. And then in the second round, I had a bit of a memory issue because of this lack of preparation, but still played overall better than I should have. Fortunately, did not have to pass on to the next round and tell everybody that I was bowing out at that point, but naturally was just kind of eliminated at that point. But that was a moment where I realized, wow, there is a lot to be said for this mental aspect of preparation, which I had never really considered before, and was also trying to figure out what to do with my life after I finished here at school. And more school seemed like something I could wrap my mind around and figure out how to do, and it would mean I wouldn't have to make any decisions about my life for a little while. So I followed my wife to Indiana where she was doing her master's and started a master's program in counseling, and then ended up doing a PhD in counseling psych and specialized in exercise science and performance studies, and now have become, I guess I wouldn't say a sports psychologist, but generally known now as performance psychologist. So.
Wow, interesting. Would you say that, one of the first keys to unlock that door for performers is to try to reach a more mindful state in performances, because adrenaline can usually just feed panic, and but getting somebody to have enough mental discipline in a performance is sort of the first thing that maybe unlocks those better performances. That and practicing it for competitions.
Right. Yeah. So the moral of the story isn't that you don't have to practice. Like I learned that I really did need to practice, but you're right. There's a fellow who used to be director of the U.S. Olympic Committee's sports psych program, and he said that there are three things that athletes have to be able to do to be able to effectively perform, and one of them is to be able to avoid judgment in the moment. In training and practice, sure, there can be some judgment there, of course, but on the field, on stage, no judgment. The other is to be able to be present in that moment, not in the future, not in the past. And then the third is to be able to understand what you control and what you don't. Right? So bad calls on the field, you don't control those. You don't control what the other players do on stage, whether the pianist is playing faster than you'd like or louder, or the conductor is doing something that you don't understand. Those aren't things that we control, yet can very much get sucked into stressing about and kind of obsessing about. And meanwhile, not being intently focused on the things that we do have control over.
Right, right. You touched upon a few things here. We're going to get to some of those points a little further down the discussion here. But the first part, the mindfulness and living in the moment, I want to tie into what we were talking about earlier about karma, about cause and condition, and contemplation. And like probably many of our viewers, I have spent time doing monastic retreats and eating meals in a monastic style. And for those people who haven't maybe experienced that, it's when the food is presented to you is to contemplate the origin of that food, who grew it, who harvested it, how did it get to the table, who cooked it, all the efforts made by people, and and when you consider all of that before you dive in, and begin to sort of appreciate how you came to this moment, it's getting to that present tense that we need on stage. But if you've ever eaten a meal that way, it's the result is so much more awareness of the taste, and the satisfaction, consequently, of the flavors and the textures, and ultimately, and this is good news for dieters, uh, you feel so much more fulfilled with less food in a way. And taking that idea to the concert stage, I don't know if you can envision or imagine that the causes and conditions that we talked about in the history of music that leads us to the moment of this piece. Not just the history of music, but of course for the performer, it's all the time spent being immersed in that world of preparing a piece. Do you see that those causes and conditions and the contemplation of that, maybe going in before a performance, might also help somebody get to that more mindful, sort of in the moment kind of mindset? Something. I mean, I don't know that's something you ever prescribed to somebody, but is that something that you think there could be a way of opening that door for somebody to get to that place?
Yeah, it reminds me of, there's a particular musician that comes to mind, was very thoughtful about cultivating gratitude in the weeks leading up to the audition itself.
Mm-hmm.
And instead of stressing so much about whether they were going to be able to prove themselves or play effectively or win the job, they tried to focus less on potential outcomes of the audition and more on just gratitude for lots of things, for the condition of their instrument that day, or the acoustics that they were able to play in, and the work that they did have already, and family and so forth. And that's what I was reminded of when you're talking about seemingly kind of cultivating an experience of gratitude, not just like an intellectual gratitude for where the food came from, but an actual experience of it in the moment. And it seemed to me in her description that that did carry over into the audition being one that she experienced less pressure in terms of having to get a particular outcome.
Right.
And this reminds me a little bit of my own situation with the instrument that I have, and that the journey to me connecting with this particular instrument is a very winding, twisting road, and the instrument itself is very old. The date is 1734. It's almost 300 years old, and
Wow.
so
Think about who might have played that instrument, right?
exactly right. So not just, and this is the little homework I did. I looked up 1734. What was happening in 1734 in the world? And George Washington was 2 years old. Haydn was 2 years old. This is 22 years before Mozart was even born. I mean, to imagine, what the world was like, who made this instrument, what the first owner of the instrument might have been, who played it in the 300 years since then, and when I had it fall into my life, like the daily practicing of it on this instrument, instead of just kind of taking it for granted and being this tool that makes sound come out. Whenever I really kind of took a moment to reflect and think about those sorts of things, it does make you feel differently.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, appreciation is something you experience in the present tense too, and taking that moment to acknowledge all those things does also, I think, help you bring you into this moment where, as performers, we really need to live. Because it really is that uh, bringing the past forward that takes you out of the moment, and you don't perform as well. So that's a really interesting thing. This is my instrument behind me here. It's not 300 years old. It's about 6 years old. But it's those things that we experience in the moment, like you say, your instrument, and realizing where it came from and how it came to this place in your hands at this moment. And string instruments do improve with age too, so it grew kind of probably in its journey in terms of like a fine wine maturing, right? But it's also just even the moment, as you mentioned, like auditions, like when you step into that concert hall that has a beautiful sound, and that's something that happens in the moment, and that can really let anxiety fall by the wayside when you're enjoying the sound of yourself in that space. So but yeah, it's just yet another example of just how in performance, that clear mind, where you're not bringing um, the past forward with the past, positive or negative, you let go of it, hopefully. And one certainly can imagine that a negative experience in the past, bringing that onto the stage is only going to make your fear and anxiety more pronounced. But it's also fear of the future, too, I think. And what are some of the examples? Maybe for our audience, Noah has interviewed some of the great musicians of the world in his research, and a lot of those interviews can be found on your blog, which is called the Bulletproof Musician .com for those who wanted to look it up. It's a fascinating site, and it's a real resource for people, whether you're a musician or not, I think, just to understand the psychology. But yeah, any examples of just future anxiety, fear of the future, sort of affecting us, the mind?
Well, it's interesting because there is a bit of research on that phenomenon, and what seems to happen sometimes is that we get attached to a potential future that we imagine in our lives, right? Like a future in which we have this particular job or that particular job, or we've ended up in this city and we're surrounded by these people and we get to work with these folks and make music and so forth. We see that as a possibility because it could be something that happens in the future, but we get very attached to that idea of that future only. And don't see that there could be downsides of that, or there are other futures that might be even better that we can't envision. And in advance, it seems we start experiencing a bit of loss aversion to a future that isn't even real, or that isn't even necessarily going to happen, or that would be like good for us. And so that fear of losing something that isn't ours or doesn't even exist and exert a lot of pressure actually on what happens right now and at this one particular moment.
Been there and done that. You know, when we audition for orchestras, it usually involves a flight. And I just remember an audition for myself of flying into the city I'd never been, and from the plane looking down, thinking how beautiful it looked, and then that drive from the airport to the concert hall, and you're going through these neighborhoods thinking, oh, I'd like to live there, and I'd like to live here. And meantime, it took me out of that present tense, and it put a lot of pressure on me because I already attached a certain desire to win that job, rather than being sort of more of a blank canvas. And yeah, it wasn't a good audition because I had really projected far out and ahead of myself, and it translated into that kind of pressure to succeed rather than to sort of be myself and live in that moment. And you know, there are a lot of notes to play before someone was going to be offering me that job, and it didn't happen that day. Moving on to another important cause and condition is of music, karma, if you will. It's just the path of choosing to become a musician itself. There's a wonderful quote from the great Leonard Bernstein. In fact, I should just add that we are sitting right above, behind us, Leonard Bernstein Place, 65th Street, at Lincoln Center, between Broadway and 10th Avenue. Because Leonard Bernstein was the composer for West Side Story. And this is where that all took place back in the 50s, right? So anyway, with back to the quote, he says, I can't live one day without hearing music, playing it, studying it, or thinking about it. And I think that sort of sums up what so many musicians feel. It's like catching a bug, or a compulsion, an addiction, if you will. And I just wonder, you know, for yourself, when did you catch the bug? When did you feel that moment? Was there a pivotal moment when you said, I must do this with my life's work?
You know, it's interesting because my story is sort of the opposite of that, in that so according to my mom, when I was 2 or 1, whenever I started saying words, I said "Oa waik mugas," and she didn't know what I was saying because it wasn't even that intelligible. But we were at a friend's house and they had music playing, stereo, and I said, "Oh, nice mugas," and she kind of figured out I was saying Noah likes music. So my cousins were already in Ithaca, New York, starting Suzuki lessons and classes, and so she was like, "Well, let's go visit them for summer and start you up." And so all this to say, I started without really knowing what I was getting myself into at such a young age, and really just kind of continued to do whatever I had been doing sort of mindlessly, actually, like without ever having thought or considered or asked myself, why am I doing this, or do I want to do this at all even? So I, then I ended up here, master's program, you start seeing maybe not light at the end of the tunnel, but you start wondering, well, what comes after this then? And I wasn't having a lot of luck coming up with things that really excited me, or sort of sparked joy, or that led to this sort of obsessive need to continue to learn more and grow in this direction. And was having a conversation with some friends in a quartet about what we do if we won the lottery, and I knew just immediately I wouldn't continue to play the violin. I don't know what I would do, but I wouldn't continue. But they all had ideas for things that they would do in music, and so I was like, well, that's weird. Like, maybe I should think about this a little bit. It turns out it wasn't just them. Like, asked that question, I think a lot of the people around me had ideas on what they would want to do to expand what they were doing. And so talked to my girlfriend, again, now wife, about this, and she said, yeah, you don't actually have to continue to play the violin. That's not the thing that you want to do. And so it led to a bit of soul searching, and eventually I actually, for once, asked myself the question, is this something I want to do? Would I choose this? Like, why would I choose this? And discovered, actually, because around the same time I was starting to learn about sports psychology, that turns out I was actually much more interested in the psychology and the how of practicing and performing than the actual doing of it itself. And so yeah, it did take me a while to get to the point where that moment happened, and it wasn't in the direction that I had been going in, kind of thoughtlessly or mindlessly for so long, but in a different way.
Yeah. No, I don't know actually that many musicians that have that story. Most of us have that moment, but you know, it must be liberating too to have all the talent and certainly you had a passion for it, but then you find another niche. In helping people in the world of music, and even if you put that lovely violin down for the for the moment. Um, uh, but you know, I think about you had your moment though in that competition where combination of the lack of preparation and leading to maybe that performance anxiety is something that we all hit that wall at some point where it goes from, you know, that innocent fun to where we suddenly have to deal with the reality of that. In order to be successful, what we do is we have to be, take a phrase from your website, we have to be bulletproof on stage, and that takes, you know, a great deal of training. So let me ask you, just in do you find, you may not be a practicing Buddhist, for all I know, but you didn't have the haircut for it, by the way. You look like a venerable, but yeah, no attachment to your hair, and that's a good thing. Attachments get you in trouble. But just in preparing for this conversation that we're having in this program, I did have a conversation with the venerable, and she was saying that. Surprisingly to me, but that a lot of people are living sort of a Buddhist life, or are living in a way and values that are consistent with a lot of Buddhist philosophy, and are not even aware of it. But whether you fit into that category or not, or you've actually done a little studying on Buddhist philosophy, but there's something in your own teachings that seems to be consistent with some of the things that we've talked about. Certainly, you know, mindfulness and all that. But mindfulness exercises are a form of meditation, for example. So maybe it's a point of departure. Comment on that.
I've been told from some who know more about this that a lot of the things that we talk about in the realm of sport or performance psychology do remind them of various Buddhist teachings or philosophies or principles. And I have to be honest, I haven't looked much into it, but my grandmother on my father's side was practicing Buddhist, and there are things that I remember about her that perhaps are characteristic of that. But one of the things, for instance, that my dad just recently reminded me of is that every morning she would wake up, before she got out of bed, she would take maybe 10, 15, 20 minutes even until she sort of fatigued, going through each member of the family. And she had a large family, brothers and sisters and cousins and extended family, and then us and so forth. She'd think about everyone and think about what she was grateful for each of them. And that was sort of like a daily practice that she had for years. And what's interesting is, so there was this movie that I remember watching once, The Bucket List, with Morgan Freeman and Jack Nicholson, and they were talking about the afterlife, or at least the idea that the Egyptians supposedly had of the afterlife, and that you'd be greeted at these gates by someone who would ask you, did you find a joy in your life, and did your life bring joy to others? And your answer to those two questions would, I think, determine whether you got to move further and so forth. And when I thought about those two questions, there are two people in my life that I've come across that immediately came to mind. And one of them was one of my early teachers. That was part of my formative development. And the other was my grandmother. Oh. And not that other people that I've come across in my life are not awesome, incredible people and so forth, but just in terms of the way they carry themselves and the effect they seem to have on others just naturally as a theme throughout their lives. My grandmother was one of them. And so I think, there are probably aspects of my experience of my grandmother and my teacher and so forth that have affected, hopefully, some of what my own kind of lens through which I see the different skills and strategies in sports psychology and performance psychology have led to in terms of how I've then shared them with others.
Right, right. So you also, it sounds like from your grandmother, you got a little trickle down Buddhism, I'd say, right?
Yeah.
Well, that is part of, cause and condition, right? That your father wouldn't be the person he is if it weren't for your grandmother, and you're just part of that line, I guess. And when I think about some of the things that I'm sure that you deal with in counseling people on the psychology of performing, you want to run us quickly through that fight or flight syndrome and what the physiology of what happens to our bodies, and just because I know for me I certainly experienced that as a young player in auditions, and what do you do about it is the next question. And I know for me that and I was a student in this building when I thought I've got to figure out this problem of this adrenaline rush that you get when you sense fear, and we're programmed that way, right? Matter of survival when it came to earliest prehistoric times, I guess. So. And I remember going to a bookstore and buying maybe it's a book you even know, because I think it's still in print. It's called How to Meditate, and I forget the author, but I have seen it in bookstores. It's like 120 pages. It's not a long book, but that was sort of the beginning for me of and it was the 80s, and I think that you had books like The Inner Game of Tennis, which westernized a lot of Eastern philosophy, a lot of it coming out of Buddhism and other practices. And so that for me, I know that book, How to Meditate, was for a Westerner a great path towards sort of finding a way of cultivating mental discipline and the imagery. I mean, and again, you're the professional. I'm sort of the layperson who's found their way in this area on my own. But imagery being helpful in this case, as he describes like a meditation of like you're sitting on a hill looking down at a river. And, the point is just to stay focused on that scene. But, if a boat floats down in your field of view, the more practiced mind will just let it pass on by, like that stray thought that comes through your head when you're meditating. What you don't want to do is get on that boat and end up somewhere down the river. And we have all probably experienced that in meditation or mindfulness training. I love that description, but I mean, as a professional, any comments about that? I mean, things that you either teach or concepts or practices that.
Yeah, one of the things that I found most fascinating is that in a similar way that you described this boat and not wanting to get attached to this boat, there's a tendency, I think, for us to get attached to the idea of needing to be calm in order to perform effectively. And the more important it is we feel we need to be calm in order to perform effectively, the more anxious we're likely to get, because as soon as you start noting yourself getting anxious, you start worrying about that, which makes you more anxious, which makes you worry more, and it leads to this sort of spiral. Whereas if you can observe that, you're starting to get excited, perhaps, as opposed to nervous, because physiologically, there's not actually a huge difference between the state of excitement and the state of anxiety. And so what they've found recently, since the 80s, is that when we approach situations from a challenge perspective, if we feel it's a challenge to be overcome, so we end up having more of a positive mindset with physical activation and excitement, we tend to perform better, whether it's singing or whether it's high stakes testing or whether it's public speaking. Across the board, people have found that performances are better. Whereas if we approach something as a threat and we have this increased physical activation, along with mental doubts and worries and concerns and stress and so forth, then we don't perform so well. And so physiologically, again, it's very similar, but the mental experience of it is vastly different. And so yeah, actually they found that cognitive anxiety, as it's called, as opposed to somatic anxiety, the physical, cognitive anxiety tends to be much more predictive of performance than somatic anxiety.
Wow, that's really fascinating, and I thoughts I never had, because we all do feel, when the moment comes, you want to be calm, and that's, in a way, that's its own attachment too, that we probably should let go. But to know that, if you sense that as excitement rather than anxiety, something positive, turn that right around. That's I'll take that to the stage next time.
Of course, physically, we do want to be relaxed or loose.
Mhm.
Like that is something that does matter. We can't be tight, intense,
Right.
as we try.
Yeah. Well, that's the physical part for sure. Can if you can deal with the tension that's in your body, then the mind can usually follow. I wanted to talk about too, in performance, going further with the idea of living in the moment, of detaching from carrying the past forward, or getting ahead of yourself and looking to the future. One of the most important sutra in Buddhism is called the Heart Sutra. And in it, it deals with the concept of anatta, which is basically a no-self kind of place, a place of emptiness. And that's a very paraphrased uh, definition of it. But certainly that no-self is part of what you detaching from past and future and live in the moment is sort of requires that giving up of these strong attachments. And I don't know, for me, I like to think of a musician in that state, of um, real focus. Is we do lose ourselves in the music. It's a phrase that we hear often enough, losing oneself in the music. But I like to think of us as sort of the vessel, through which the composer's work flows through us. We are recreating an art form. Something was written maybe 500 years ago or 100 years ago, but even if it was written yesterday, we have to convey what somebody else's vision was. And one can get very philosophical about where does music come from. Some people feel it's a very divine thing. Even composers themselves sort of talk about it, and as they don't know where it comes through them, maybe from some divine world. But the music just should pass through us, and that sort of no self idea, and certainly we all know that if you carry a big ego into performance, um, that attachment to your ego in the moment can lead to certainly a very judgmental mind, which is not going to help us in the moment. And it's that critical voice that we have to let go of, which is basically ego. And all that can lead to anxiety, which you certainly don't want. Insecurity is another thing, and that again is very much tied to ego. And and yet we work in a field where there are some pretty large egos out there to get out on stage. I'm curious to the artists that you've worked with and people you've interviewed. Do they talk about putting aside their ego? Because a vessel that's already half full of ego is not a lot of room for the composer. And I do like to think of if the empty vessel. We've done our homework. There's an automaticity then about the music. We know it so well, physically, mechanically, to produce it, and we've immersed ourselves in the world of the composer. But at that point, if there's, if we've been true to the composer and and the mechanics of playing it are taken care of, the music does just pass through you in a way. And I think that's for us, it's to put it in a Buddhist context, it's a real anatta moment. It's a moment of no self. And the great performances, the best performances that I've done, I feel like you get to the end and it's over, and it's like, people may congratulate you, whatever, which is, feels nice afterwards, but I wasn't even sort of aware of myself maybe so much in those concerts. I don't know. I'm babbling, but you've talked to so many people. I'm curious, if that's you get a feel for.
Yeah, I mean, that speaks to the state of, being in flow or being in the zone, as athletes often call it, and it's where you are completely absorbed in the present moment, not in the future, past, as you said, and not connected in any way to how you're doing, as it were. You're not keeping score, and so yeah, you tend to lose yourself and just be immersed in what's happening. I think this is related to what you're saying and asking. There could be a little bit of selection bias here in terms of who I've asked to speak to and who has said yes. But one of the things that strikes me about a lot of the folks I've talked to, regardless of how long they've been performing, how famous they are, and so forth, is how human they are, in the sense that they seem very willing to admit that they know a ton. There's also a lot that they don't know, and that they're okay in a way with not knowing everything, and they're not trying to pretend that they know everything, and they seem to be very comfortable with that in a way. Not comfortable in the sense that they're not continuing to seek to get better and to discover and learn more, but a little bit like the Pablo Casals quote, perhaps. Something like he was maybe 80 years old, and someone asked why he continues to practice. He doesn't have to. And I think I'm starting to figure it out, or I think I'm starting to get it, or
Yeah,
something
still
along
getting
those
better.
lines. Yeah. And that's the thing that is sort of strikes me about the folks that I've talked to, that comes through.
Mm-hmm.
There's a degree of humbleness, and not, they don't lack confidence.
No.
But at the same time, they also are constantly working on confidence. Like, they're not like supremely like confident, as in bordering on overconfidence.
Right.
They don't have these doubts. And so there's this interesting balance there between knowing a ton, but also knowing that they don't know some things, but also sort of being okay with that, but still seeking more, being confident in what they can do, yet not overconfident and blind to things that they can still improve on. Because that's the other thing that comes through too. They seem very willing, ego-wise, and open to seeking out and working on the things that, to quote one of my friends who was on the show, that they're crummy at, or not where they want to be with them yet. But it's, again, kind of a weird balance of the different continuum, I suppose, of things.
Well, I was just thinking as you were describing that about how confidence is different than ego in a way, because confidence is just trusting oneself, trusting that the work that you've done, your body knows that work, and you know, and that ego seems to be almost that sort of critical judgment, of how good I am, and awareness of how good I am. And I love the idea of the people you talked about, even regardless of how famous they are, feeling like they don't know it all, and that so that there isn't, ego would say, I know it all, and someone who's stepped aside of that and is willing to see that there's still that road ahead. Even Pablo Casals, who was one of the great cellists of all time, that at age 89, late 80s, I think, because he lived the early 90s, I think, that he still was practicing because he still had more to learn. I'm still getting better, I'm still, yeah, it's wonderful. And just on the subject of no self in a performance, and of sort of letting the music flow through you and sort of not making it about oneself. And again, I go back to the great Leonard Bernstein, who was so charismatic that you would suspect a huge ego. I didn't know him personally. I did get to record with him in the New York Philharmonic at the end of his career. But Bernstein said, the quote is, "If I don't become Brahms or Tchaikovsky or Stravinsky when I'm conducting their works, then it won't be a great performance." So he's not trying to be Leonard Bernstein in the program. He's trying to connect with that composer in a way that, at least that's my interpretation of the quote, supersede his own ego. We've all heard performances where the a performance might be wonderful in so many ways, but it doesn't sound like the composer. It sounds like somebody put their stamp on it, and it may be Mozart as arranged by whoever the performer is, and not something that's quite as in touch with the real nature of Mozart. Maybe someone who thought much more about their own feelings about it rather than maybe taking the time to study and as the Bernstein quote is, of trying to become that composer in the moment of the performance. So that's some thoughts about that no self thing. Part of the no self thing leads to the concept too of just as performers, it's sort of an act of giving. It really is, and in Buddhism, true giving is really having no attachments. No attachments for the ego or for the giver or for the gift. And so to get up on stage and if, again, you just let the music flow through you. Yes, it's more of a true gift that way because it's not about you so much. Maybe you get up and play this because you so admire it and you think it's such a masterpiece. But giving again, if imagine easier to imagine in a physical gift that if I gave you something, it was something I really treasured, I might want it back. That I still have an attachment to it. So I'm not really giving freely, and I think that's also something to contemplate. Just as a performer, the idea that it's a gift, and I'm sure have met people, and maybe people have opened up and talked to you about too, of just like still recalling that great concert that they played, X number of seasons ago, and it's that well, it may mean something to them very much personally, but the more you hang on to that too, you're no longer that person, right? So it maybe detracts from, that's part of carrying the past forward. If I had to play that piece tomorrow, I'm still thinking about that moment from 6 years ago when I felt like so great about it. That's also is now no longer, it's just like the gift that you're still attached to. You're not really going to, that performance tomorrow of that same piece is not going to be given as freely. And I think that maybe connects to that as well. So one of the leads us to one of the most basic core beliefs in Buddhism is that everything in this world is impermanent, and that concept of impermanence. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts in your practice about how making people realize the impermanence of that thing which they are suffering anxiety about? And since we're in the world of music and you work largely with musicians, it's obviously about a performance. Or a work that they're learning or something. And that concept of impermanence, does that speak to any of the training and advice and counseling that you've done?
This may not be directly related to that, but it does make me think of confidence. And we might have already kind of touched on it, but athletes see confidence not as like a static state that one achieves. I guess it's the same as many things. We don't work out to get to a certain point and then no longer work out. We don't practice to get a certain point and no longer practice. Like it's a continuous process, and to continue to grow. And so I think with confidence too, there's a tendency, I think, for us to admire folks who seem confident, to think that, oh, if I could just get to that point, then things will be better. But great musicians as well as athletes, it's something that you continue to work on and to build, and it goes up and it goes down, and it depends on the situation, and it varies and it fluctuates, but it's like a continuous process of cultivating confidence that, I think there are a lot of things that we might wish would stay at a certain point, but, for better, for worse, nothing tends to.
So I could be great today and lousy tomorrow, or vice versa. It's that impermanence, and I do take comfort in that, and it is one of the ways I think for myself and my own finding my own way in this career and dealing with performance anxiety, is because it's something we all have to overcome. I mean, there isn't one musician I've ever met who says I never get nervous anymore. I mean, you're always going to be nervous. In fact, just this summer I was around some really famous world-class musicians at a festival, and they were working with students. We're helping train the next generation, and in a master class setting, and they each admitted, I still get nervous, all the time. It's going to happen at really at every concert. So it's that idea of though it's that it's a fleeting thing, though. And I guess I find in my own conversations with myself is there's the mental discipline of learning to sort of try to bring your mind around to being focused and getting ready for a performance. And some days it's easier, some days it's harder, because that isn't permanent. That when it's easy, it's not necessarily going to be there every time. But I do find also just, reminding myself of, I can rationalize. Part of it is a discipline and training of your mind. And part of it is, at least I find comforting thoughts, early on in my career, when I was trying to win my first job, or second or third job maybe, but it was early on in my professional life that there was a line from a Woody Allen film, and it was 90% of life is just showing up. And the idea that kind of know self, and live in the moment is kind of what I took from that. But there's also a little bit of impermanence thrown in on that. And that's always sort of stayed with me. And I guess there's another quote too that about the same time, well, a little later in my career, that in humanistic Buddhism, there is sort of a motto of this person, this place, this time. 6 words, but it just sort of brings you, into this moment. But that's the thing about, I guess, that living in the moment is you realize how impermanent everything is, because that's already in the past and it's gone. So I do take comfort in the fact that and I think it does help lead to that sort of no self place. Is just that if that was a mistake, it's gone. And if that was the greatest thing I ever played, it's also gone. So it's easy to sort of detach from that. And I think that for someone who's understands some of these Buddhist concepts, it's so easy to apply them to performing and in any situation that might induce anxiety, of finding a way of being your best in those moments still. Anyway, in just some of our closing thoughts here, I wanted to just leave us with a few more thoughts here about the power and sort of the magic of music. It certainly is that universal language. It speaks to us without words. It's something that everyone seems to readily understand. it's also something that while it can be written, it is written down. Oftentimes, it is some music is just passed on orally, but um, it's not music when it's on a piece of paper. Um, so part of that causal condition is that it needs to be performed by somebody in order to be heard, and for that reason, it really only exists in this moment, because I could have the sheet music here in front of me, but that's just a piece of paper with some ink on it. It's the performers who bring it to life, and we are people who, by design, have to be living in that moment. I think I'd be curious to hear you speak to this point too, which is that everybody seems to know that the world is moving faster and faster. And there are more distractions than our grandparents and our parents had to deal with, I would assume, in their daily lives. And it becomes all the more difficult, I think, for people to find, peel away the layers of their mind and all the different multitasking levels in which we function, and find that calm. And maybe that's why there's so much more curiosity. We have apps for it now on our phones, right? But do you find more people, more thirst for people seeking out your help and guidance to find this, not just even in performances, but in their daily life, just because of all the noise?
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit of, I don't know too much about this world, but the more prevalent smoking is, the more prevalent, how to stop smoking programs become. And
Right.
I do think I'm starting to see, more books, more apps, more programs on how to just kind of clear out all the other mental clutter and distractions, and just be more present, more focused, whether it's walks, whether it's meditation, whether it's exercising, or engaging in hobbies and activities like knitting in a particular way that's more mindful. It does seem like there's an interest in trying to find ways of being less distractible. And even in terms of practicing, I think people are talking about the value of practicing in such a way that it cultivates the kind of single-minded presence and focus that's necessary in performance. And that if we practice in a distracted way, we're not really cultivating that skill that we need when it comes time to perform. So yeah, I think I am seeing.
Yeah, I think there's a real need for it, and it's interesting that there's more than one path sometimes to getting to the same place. And just like the Venerable had said to me, there are people leading Buddhist lives who don't even really know it. And I think we as musicians are, it's necessary for us to find some of these values in order to succeed on stage, and the fact that they are very much in step with Buddhist values and Buddhist, some of the core beliefs and training. It's all there. um, and I want to thank you so much for joining me in this conversation today. You've helped so many people. I always find it fascinating to talk with you, and I'm grateful for your time and energy today. So
Yeah, thank you for
so
having
much.
me.
I'd like to leave us just with a few closing thoughts too, and that I just hope that for our viewers, that as you listen to music now, I hope that maybe you can sort of find a more mindful experience about, we have music in our lives. It's all surrounded by us. It can be in the elevator, it can be on the background at work, or while you do other things. But I think you'll find greater pleasure and meaning if you're not behind the wheel, but maybe make space in your life for that contemplative moment experience, like the um, monastic eating style. Just maybe um, clearing your mind out of distractions, and trying to engage with whatever music it is, because it doesn't have to be like the classical music that world that we're involved in, but any kind of music that moves you, you'll find that much more in the experience when you maybe aren't as distracted. And lastly, I should say also that, talking today about the Buddhist aspects of my career and how it's helped me, and a lot of the people Noah has worked with, whether they know it as Buddhist concepts or not, these are the same things that are helping them be better at their jobs, and probably, I'm sure, in their lives too. And I would just hope that, maybe from this conversation, people look at their own careers and find the Buddhist values in what you do, and that right mindset that might make your job even more meaningful, pleasant, enjoyable, and make you better at it. So I want to say thank you all for watching. Xie and Amitofo.
Thank you for that great discussion, Mr. Ralske and Dr. Kageyama. I know I have learned a lot about how Buddhism and music intersect through this lecture. In the beginning, Mr. Ralske had compared karma to the dependent origination of music, and how certain causes and conditions led to new genres of music. An example he gave was how slavery led to jazz, and how jazz is a combination of hymns, African rhythms, and call and response. A big point that stands out to me as a musician is the point Dr. Kageyama made about contemplating the present while playing an instrument. Thinking about the instrument's history and what is actually happening physically to allow you to make music from an inanimate object, it can help change your perspective about music. This relates back to the Buddhist concept of staying in the present moment. And on that same topic, Dr. Kageyama discussed the importance of the present moment while performing and allowing mistakes to disappear without attachment. As a fellow musician, all of these tips definitely resonate with what I believe in. And for a few announcements, we hope that you will join us for our next lecture for more discussions like this. The next lecture is entitled The Art of Scientific Education, and will be given by Professor Lan Hong on October 30th. The lecture after that is entitled The Story Behind the Dream, The Power of Teamwork, and will be given by Olympic gold medalist Ling Ling Sun on November 27th. We hope to see you there on the next video of the 2022 BLIA North America Cloud Lecture Series. Thank you for joining us today.